The wait is finally over. The new NFL season starts this week. I'm Diana Rossini, senior NFL insider at The Athletic, and my new podcast, Scoop City, is ready to be your go-to football companion this season. Twice a week, myself and Chase Daniel, who played quarterback for 7 different franchises in 14 years, will take you inside the inner workings of the NFL. You'll hear fresh intel, deep analysis, and fascinating interviews with big-ticket guests. So far, we've sat down with Andy Reid, Josh Allen, Sean Payton, and a host of others, with loads more to come. So check out Scoop City this NFL season. Listen wherever you get your podcasts.
The Athletic.
Hello and welcome to the Race IndyCar Podcast. We're back at Milwaukee. It's not very often that JR and I get our teeth into a new oval coming onto the IndyCar calendar. Of course, not quite new because it's been on the calendar before, but at least in this proper era with how the cars are at the moment, this is the first time we were going to Milwaukee since 2015. So something exciting for us to get stuck into, and a track that raced differently to a lot of other ovals as well. So something a little bit interesting for us to see how the cars were going to adapt and how they were going to race on this circuit. And obviously, amid the context of this current IndyCar package being quite tricky to get right on ovals in terms of creating the right spectacle, it was interesting to know how it was going to all work out. And I think it worked out pretty well for everyone. The races were really interesting, lots of strategy going on. The degrading tyres meant that we had lots of different strategies going on. We had big undercuts and lots of people taking big strategy gambles. And yeah, just some really interesting racing. So we'll get into all of that on this week's show. Obviously, we'll talk about Alex Palou and Will Power and how their weekends swung from pendulum to pendulum. And we'll get into some of the key stories from the races. Have a little look ahead to Nashville, but we are going to come back next week for another episode before the Nashville race to preview that properly. We'll talk a little bit about Indy next. We'll talk a little bit about some of the other big stories from the race and the leaders circle as well. We'll obviously get into that. JR, I want to start just by asking just your general opinion, really, before we go into any great detail about how you thought the races went. And obviously we didn't know, like I've said already, we didn't really know how this car was going to race on this track, and with this package and with the hybrid coming in, we've got a bit of a heavier car and stuff like that. I'm just keen to know if you enjoyed the races and what you thought of them, really.
It was interesting watching the races because I feel like there was very good racing, and we saw a lot of the things that you hope for to kind of did materialize. Milwaukee, we talked on the pre-race, or after Portland, kind of the pre-race to Milwaukee, about the way that it's an unusual track just because of the way that the pavement is, that the preferred lane tends to be sort of the second lane, or like lane 1 3/4, kind of, couple of wheels on that inside lane. But basically, rather than it being a situation where you've got cars driving down to the apex and you need for a outside lane to get rubbered in to work, you're always going to have Milwaukee's interest, an interesting, sort of transgression away from tracks, those types of tracks. I mean, it's unusual just compared to any oval track, really, from that perspective, which is just that the very bottom lane isn't really the preferred line, but just because it's the inside lane, you're naturally going to end up with cars, unless it's like absolutely terrible, you have cars ending up down there, because in part just because as a driver, it's kind of your natural instinct. If the bottom's open, you're just going to try it at least now and again, and so that keeps it clean at a bare minimum, in a way that your natural instinct is not to go up in the gray in a second lane that like nobody's using, as we've seen in a number of races over the last, call it 10 years or something. So it lends itself just to having this kind of, multiple options through the corner. You saw that really materialize. I think that was exaggerated even some by the fact that this car, because of both the weight and the lower downforce compared to the last time we were here, it's just slower through the corner. It's harder to make work through the corner. I mean, the number of times that you're seeing guys like make at least 3 downshifts without anything going wrong, I think just, kind of exemplifies that. And so all of those things made for, to me, given the kind of current package, it to be a great racetrack. The flip side to that is, and this is something that I would have said about Milwaukee in this context 10 years ago or something also. So it's not specific to the way that it is right now or the way the cars are right now compared to the way that they were the last time we were at Milwaukee. But there were also a couple of things kind of on the other side of that fence that I think as obviously a knowledgeable IndyCar insider watching the race, you're picking up on all of that I sort of just talked about, like that you've got these different lanes, you've got basically all the makings for a really good racetrack and kind of venue and event. I know from being there that Milwaukee is a very tough track, and that I'm watching. I was watching the onboards just throughout practice, qualifying, the race, thinking like some of these guys on a very regular basis are driving the cars exceptionally well. Like it's hard to be really good and consistently fast lap to lap in those kinds of conditions with the car the way that it is. Clearly, just what you could see the little nuances of the way the cars were handling. Like, it was not easy out there for anybody. And so even guys that in a relative sense had good cars, like, not easy for them to continue to stay at the front, not make mistakes, take advantage of that. We know how talented the IndyCar field is, just up and down the paddock, we'll say, both the drivers and the teams. And so I just found it's kind of like, this has all the ingredients of being something that should be really extraordinary to watch. And I guess I felt like it just didn't quite tip that scale, to be something that was actually like, you really had to look for it and kind of know that it's there, which is a broader topic that we've brought up at times, in IndyCar or on this podcast over the last few years. Just that it's kind of like, okay, is it time to take a bigger swing at making the basis for, like, the foundation of what the car is, something that more excessively communicates the fact that this is like a hard thing to do, and really be able to make it known that this is difficult, and the guys that are winning these races, or the guys that are running up front, or the guys that are working their way through the field, are doing something really remarkable. Because I think that was what I was left thinking for myself, but then also thinking like, I'm not sure that was that easy to tell that that's what was going on, and that's kind of a thing that I feel like I've questioned a little bit just in general of late. I want as a fan and somebody who's obviously has a lot invested in IndyCar just in general here. I find myself just kind of sitting here like, I really want for success for these guys to feel like it matters, and that there's like a real sense of accomplishment. Not just, they have a sense of accomplishment because they know it's hard. McLaughlin, Pato, whatever, when they win these races and their teams, they know they're doing something, pretty exceptional in order to do that. But from the outside, it's less clear to me that that's as apparent as it sort of should be. So, I think it being such a good race and having so many of those things, and still feeling like, I don't know, is this apparent? Is this obvious enough? It kind of left me feeling a little bit both ways about it when it was all said and done.
The first thing I thought of while you were talking about that was, I know this shouldn't be my biggest takeaway from Milwaukee, and I won't go into too much detail, but I felt that after the races that I had to issue an internal apology to Christian Lundgaard, because I was watching his practice on board, the first practice, and he was just so low. And I was thinking, like, have we got a new line around here? Like, is the middle not the line anymore? Have we like defaulted to IndyCar, like bottom of the track, like you were talking about in the build-up podcast that we did? And then, like, a couple of minutes later, it just flicked to a different car, taking a totally normal Milwaukee line. And I was like, all right, so Christian's done a test here, and he's in practice now, and he's like rim riding the place basically compared to everybody else. And I'm like, this is not going to work. Like, this is not going to work for you, mate. You need to move up, like, get around the racetrack. And he was like by far the best Rahal car of the weekend and finished 9th and 12th in the races. And obviously just made it work for him. And I just really enjoyed that aspect of being proven wrong, looking at an IndyCar on board and just thinking, that is not going to work for you. And it just totally like paying off in the races for him, which was really cool to see. But I think Ferrucci was the more like kind of obvious one that the fans will have seen in terms of that kind of, although he was like charging the corner a lot more and still being able to keep the tyre alive. So that was super impressive to watch. But Christian was really low in terms of his line, and it was just nice to go to an oval and everyone just not converge on the same single line when they're not in race trim, basically. And even in the race, we saw people moving around lap to lap, corner to corner, and towards the end of the stint when the tyres were going, we saw people moving around, which was just such a super fun thing to see, because I feel like so many of the recent IndyCar oval races have been decided by fuel rather than tyres. So we've seen people, being able to push and do like their fastest laps at the end of a stint on an oval, which like just should be illegal in my opinion, but that's a whole other story. But the fuel was really governing the tyres were governing how this kind of worked really, and it made it so much more interesting compared to not interesting compared to the other oval races we had this year. Like, it was so much better than it, but it was just a different offering, wasn't it? A different spectacle, a different set of parameters to deal with. So that was super cool. I feel like we should start with Palou and Power, although obviously we will get to our oval race winners, but this was such a crucial weekend given that it was a double header for the championship. There was always the possibility that we were going to see some swings in the championship, and in race one it kind of proceeded as the rest of Alex Palou's IndyCar career has proceeded. His championship rival was ahead of him. Power was able to come back and finish second after a late pass on Ferrucci, but Palou was fifth and right there with him, not conceding too many points, just doing the whole Alex Palou thing of like, all right, you finished second, but I'm in the top five anyway. You've not really done much to my championship lead here. I can afford to lose a few points. And then, the second race was where it all kicked off, because Palou had a battery issue. He stopped before the race and he basically watched the race start from his pit stand while he was talking to Barry Wanzer. They changed the battery, eventually located that was the problem and got on with it, made the change. Got him back out and just kind of toured around for the whole race, but went from 27th to 19th. Such was the rate of attrition in the race. And then on the other side of things, we had Will Power, who was leading a lot of the early laps. Inside the first sort of 50 laps, he got ahead of Scott McLaughlin and then looked a pretty comfortable leader, and then got shuffled back in some of the pit stops. We had Dixon and Rossi staying out, which pushed him back another couple of spots, and then spun on a restart, which pinned him 2 laps down. He managed to get back on the lead lap by the end of the race, but actually went backwards once he was on the lead lap. He managed to lose a position after the final restart for the last caution in the closing stages, so ended up finishing 10th. So the gap's not changed an amazing amount. It's gone from 54 to 33, so it has reduced, but it means basically there's a lot of different permutations for how it might work out. But if Alex Palou finishes 9th, then he'll be the champion, and based on his overall average finish this season and also what he was able to do in Milwaukee, you don't necessarily feel like that's a stretch to expect him to finish in the top 9. I want to get into a bit of the mentality of you, JR, because you speak so well on this stuff anyway, but you've got the relevant experience in this scenario. And I think the first thing to flag was just Palou laughing on his timing stand while his car was being like worked on in the pits, and he was just like having a chuckle with Barry Wanzer, and at that point it was quite clear that there was a strong potential that he was going to lose his championship lead, or at least like have a massive dent put in it while Power's running at the front of the field, and he's just kind of like having a giggle. And then you've got Power, who obviously makes this mistake, which could have happened at any point of the season, a spin like that at any point of the Milwaukee weekend. These things do happen, but such a crucial mistake at such an important moment of the race. I wonder if you can give us a bit of insight into, just as a driver, like how do you bounce back as Power now? Maybe not in the specific scenario of like you haven't fought Palou for a championship, but you've had races where you've made a mistake or something has not quite gone your way. We know Power's always talking about, or Palou's kind of the more obvious person for this, but we know Power's kind of copied his kind of mental approach a little bit. Focus on the things that you can control. Don't worry about the things that are outside of your control. But I want to flip that and ask you, that was in Power's control. He had the power there to completely eradicate Alex Palou's lead, and he's come away from the weekend 33 points down. So what are some of the things you can do as a driver, or how can you approach Nashville in a way that isn't just sort of totally turning up there and being totally negative about everything that's happened and trying to turn that around.
Yeah, I think you have to basically, and I think both of these guys, any of the guys up at the front, I think, you don't get to the positions that they're in without probably just at this point your default being to look at things this way. But yeah, basically you have to just let what has already occurred, let that be what it was. And I'm sure I think it'd be hard to be in Will's position and not kind of be kicking yourself for, not putting yourself in a better position, kind of to your point, when it was available to you. It's also like the way that happened, like you see that happen once in that situation. And I was just sitting there like, wow, like if that was that easy to do, then I'm surprised that it doesn't happen more often, basically. And you do see guys get a little bit loose coming off corners. Milwaukee is an interesting track from that perspective. I mean, you saw some guys just loop it like out of two. I think that was probably from, transitioning from that inside pavement to the outside pavement and like not quite getting that right and being on a little too much power too early and whatever. But even just on the restarts that, I mean, I can remember even being there like in an Indy Lights car. And if you were on the gas in the middle of the corner, it's a very flat corner and you've got a lot of wheel in it. And so anyway, I mean, I guess it's basically just to say it's kind of a fluke that occurred that way. Like that's just a function of, not quite enough tire warm up, but probably being oblivious to that before it actually happens. So he'll be sort of looking back at that thinking like, damn it, like that he at least he certainly would have been like top 5-ish or something, I think, by the end, had that not happened, because it kind of screwed up his timing for just everything for the rest of the race and put him on the back foot. I mean, obviously in that final stanza of the final pit cycle, nobody had fresh tires, but Will probably had even less decent used tires at that point, if any. Well, no, I guess he did pit after he got the wave around, but basically he would have had to have gone to whatever his best used set was just after the spin. Because that was in essence like an unscheduled a set of unscheduled stops for him to come in, swap out the flat spotted tires, and then mess around with the nose or whatever. So anyway, I guess that's basically all, just to say that like it put him in the back foot in more ways than one, for even once he got back on the lead lap towards the end of the race. But to actually answer your question, I guess I would say I think the right mindset to have for everybody on the 12 team coming into the final event is, we're here with a chance. We got to basically go out and win the race, or we got to run up front all weekend. In some respects, that's when you have to win. That's actually kind of an easier mindset to adopt. When there's lots of options, that can kind of get in the way of defining the right just mental attitude, like where you're at on your own RPM band. Like, do you have to be pegged going in, or are you somewhere in between? Or for all of these guys, they kind of know where their sweet spot is. I think ultimately, like what Alex Palou has done so well is he's just in his sweet spot regardless of he probably doesn't really look at a race that he has to win from a points perspective that much differently than just his average race, because he knows that, the sort of full level of enlightenment as a race car driver or an athlete is recognizing that, you just being at your best is something that does give you the best chance at the best results, just regardless of the situation. But I think then you sort of expand that out to the group. Like, the guys that are calling strategy, all of those things. It does end up trickling down. Not everybody can just be like, in Zen mode necessarily. Like there are some tactics that come into play that either you play those things aggressively or you kind of, play them conservatively. And, there's an element of just how you go into the weekends that you'll have to kind of make some decisions in terms of where you're going to be at on that spectrum. And so, for Will and the 12 crew and Faustino and, the rest of the group there, they'll be more on the aggressive side. They'll be like, okay, well, then whatever, we're going to focus on trying to stick the car on the pole, whereas maybe if we were neck and neck, we'd say, let's just make sure the thing's in the top 5. So there are some of those little differences that will start to come into play that I think there being a more significant gap actually clarifies kind of the way that you approach it a little bit. For Alex and his guys, they've been in this spot, I feel like, so many times that I think they'll just go out and they have the right at this point, I would say, to just like do their thing and not change anything and sort of like assume in essence that that's just going to work. It's going to work out for them well enough.
I guess one of the interesting things about Nashville is that they'll, I mean, obviously in practice you can experiment with some stuff and you can change some stuff, but they've got so little track time really in the grand scheme of things that you're going to kind of turn up with what you've got and you're just going to have to get on with it, aren't you? So you're not going to tie yourself in knots necessarily wondering what you did 2 or 3 years ago or trying to, kind of revert back to a load of different stuff, because you're kind of just going to be relatively set by the time you start the weekend when you get there. This is why, I mean, there's many reasons why I'm not a racing driver, JR, but this is one of them, because I just can't get on board with the kind of I still can't understand how to be in a positive mindset about things that have happened in the past. And I know it's such a big part of, it's basically what everyone on the grid has to do, right? It's just part of what you have to kind of forget, the last race and just move on to the next thing. But I just think from a purely human perspective of things, like I'm just sat here now thinking, well, if Newgarden hadn't taken Palou out of Detroit, if he hadn't have had that spin at Iowa, and if he hadn't have had this battery issue, he'd be clear. If Power hadn't have crashed at the 500, if he hadn't have crashed at Iowa, if he hadn't have taken Scotty Mack out at Toronto, then he's like ahead in the chat. And you're just like, I'm just kind of in like a spiral mode of thinking of all these moments that have changed the season. I think this season's has been particularly that way. It's been particularly yo-yo for so many different people, and I think it's lucky that Palou, for everybody else, that Palou has had these issues, because his worst actual finish is 5th, apart from the crash at Iowa and being taken out of Detroit and this battery issue. So without his three doses of bad luck, then the rest of the field's looking pretty far behind. But there's you can go through the whole top 10 and pick out like 4 or 5 races where things have happened either inside their control or outside of their control. It's totally taken them out, and it's so close now at the end of the season that you're in striking distance, and it must be so easy to just think about those moments that have slipped away and passed you by.
You know that's the sound of another sale on your online Shopify store, but did you know Shopify powers selling in person too? That's right, Shopify is the sound of selling everywhere, online, in-store, on social media, and beyond. Shopify POS is your command center for your retail store. From accepting payments to managing inventory, Shopify is everything you need to sell in person. With Shopify, you get a powerhouse selling platform that effortlessly unites your in-person and online sales into one source of truth. Track every sale across your business in one place and know exactly what's in stock. Connect with customers in-line and online. Shopify helps you drive store traffic with plug-and-play tools built for marketing campaigns from TikTok to Instagram, and beyond. Get hardware that fits your business. Take payments by smartphone, transform your tablet into a point-of-sale system, or use Shopify's POS Go mobile device for battle-tested solution. Plus, Shopify's award-winning help is there to support your success every step of the way. Do retail right with Shopify. Sign up for a $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/theathletic, all lowercase. Go to shopify.com/theathletic to take your retail business to the next level today. Shopify.com/theathletic.
All right, we should talk about the winners of the races as well. I don't want to move too far away from them. We've obviously got Pato O'Ward winning the first race and Scott McLaughlin picking up the second race. Let's start with Pato, because that was a fascinating story. The most perfect timed race win probably in recent IndyCar memory. If you're kind of not following the pre-race build-up here, obviously NASCAR had announced their calendar for next season and confirmed a race at Mexico. Pato's been one of the most vocal, or has been the most vocal person in IndyCar about IndyCar needing a race in Mexico. I think McLaren have got behind that, and I think all the other drivers and teams have got behind that as well to a certain extent, because they know how popular Pato is and how popular a race in Mexico would be. Pato was obviously talking in the aftermath of the NASCAR calendar about being disappointed that IndyCar aren't getting there first, and a few other drivers kind of mentioning that it might be difficult for IndyCar to get there now because NASCAR's kind of filled that spot. And I don't think Mark Miles helped an enormous amount when he said that he doesn't think Pato is as famous as Adrian Fernandez, who is the last kind of high-profile Mexican driver to regularly compete in IndyCar, and made like a tongue-in-cheek comment about Pato gaining ground and actually being on some billboards now, which was, I'm sure if Mark had the opportunity, would probably take that back, and did issue a statement afterwards saying how important he felt Pato was to the series. But then Pato went and won the race and wore a big Mexican hat to the post-race press conference and properly paraded around and kind of rubbed it all in a very quiet and polite way, which was very entertaining to watch from the outside. I was quite interested by all the reaction to this, because it's such a powerful topic, IndyCar racing internationally, isn't it? It resonates so deeply with so many fans, especially of a certain era where you think back to, I mean, obviously some of the heydays of kart, but even more recently than that, you've got, history of IndyCar racing on different continents and different areas. And I think there's very powerful opinions that people have about whether they should be doing that and what the priorities of the series should be, all of that kind of stuff. And to me, I think a race in Mexico would be absolutely phenomenal. I think it would be, you see some of the Formula E races that have happened there, and, the Formula One races are obviously packed out. But you think just how big a star Pato is. I mean, I don't really care what Mark Miles says in terms of, how famous he thinks Pato is. Pato's got more followers on Instagram than the series has. So I wouldn't measure everyone's popularity by how many Instagram followers that they have, but I think that's a good marker of how big Pato is. And whenever you see him visit like the Mexican Grand Prix and stuff, he's always so popular, always one of the most popular people there, even though the Formula One grid is there. But it was a convenient timing as well at Milwaukee, because it was a race that has struggled to get people at the track in attendance in the past. I think it was even one of the reasons it was cited for the race falling off the calendar previously. And I don't know, I just think, I don't know if these two things are directly connected, but I think if there was a choice between, I don't necessarily think Mexico would be an easy race to do in terms of like the logistics and the funding that would be needed to get all the cars out there and everything. I think it's a great idea, and obviously IndyCar would benefit enormously from having a race there because of Pato and what he brings. But I think there's a lot of races on the calendar currently in North America that IndyCar could be exploiting in a much better way if they were promoted in a better way. And it might not be that the two are connected, but I feel like if you're gonna make the effort, as much as it hurts me as a Brit who would love to see IndyCar come back to Brands Hatch, that you make the effort on North America and make those races that are on the IndyCar calendar currently a success, and make sure that everybody in the cities or the local areas knows that IndyCar is racing at the tracks. So I guess that's my 2 cents on just where we're at. I think a Mexico race would be amazing, but I think it's too soon for IndyCar. And I think Mark Miles even said this and maybe didn't get the chance to explain it in a more in-depth way, or give some of his further thoughts on it. But it's a really interesting topic, and I totally understand the fans who are upset that we're not going to Mexico and that we should have a race there tomorrow. And I think just in terms of how many fans Pato has and you know what he brings to the series, I think it would be phenomenal. But I don't know. I don't know if it's really realistic for IndyCar to be thinking about, you know, a race in Mexico right now. What did you kind of take of this whole situation, JR? It was a good story pre-race.
Yeah, I mean, I always kind of, you know, appreciate. I like Mark Miles just in general, but I do think that he sort of deserved to be dunked on in this particular situation.
Can I just say, anyone who knows Mark knows that he makes comments like this in a really kind of like, he's got a really like fun sense of humor where he's quite happy to kind of, I don't know, like I don't want to talk too much for him, like I'm kind of explaining him to people who don't know him, but he's got a very particular sense of humor where he does make throwaway comments like this and give you a grin as he says them and stuff like that. And I'm not saying that's what happened here, but he is a guy who can give you a little one-liner, and you kind of have to weigh up whether he's actually speaking seriously or whether he's, you know, kind of a bit tongue-in-cheek as well.
Yeah, and I think that he may have just made a little bit too much of an offhanded, you know, comment out of this, probably. You know, like said something that was on his mind and didn't really mean to say it out loud in exactly that way or something. But he will have you know, sort of taken the jabs back, you know, with a smile here, I think. So I agree that that's worth pointing out, that, you know, this is not like something that's super contentious between these guys, I don't think. But I did like seeing Pato, like, you know, give him a little poke in the side there, because I think that was deserved. What else did it make me think? It made me think that I want to see Pato in the NASCAR race.
Oh, yeah. But it's a clash with Gateway for anyone who doesn't know, who's listening to the podcast, who doesn't know.
I could skip Gateway, man.
Well, that would be great.
NASCAR race.
I don't think Zach would be too pleased about his best driver skipping one of the races that they're particularly good at every year.
I don't know, man. Like, go put a deal together with Hendrick. Let's see the inverse of our, you know,
Kyle could do the Gateway race. Just saying, you know. Yeah,
exactly. Kyle could do Gateway if he's locked into the, you know, the playoffs already at that point. Anyway, you know, let's see what time the races are at. Like, I don't know, maybe there's got to be a way to work this out. That all aside, you know, what do I think about Mexico being on the IndyCar schedule? Absolutely. You know, I've said this to anybody who will ask, and even many who haven't asked. Like, you know, I guess there's a few things. One broad point is, if you are as a brand, you know, your IndyCar is in essence in the business of sort of selling a product here and marketing a thing, and that's what sports and entertainment, you know, ultimately kind of is, the product being the thing that we do on track. You, in this day and age, which is different, at least in some non-insignificant ways than 15, 20 years ago or something, you are just like a global brand by default, basically. And so either you're embracing that and building audience globally, or you're not, and kind of allowing that to be something that just sort of you're not taking advantage of, or not paying attention to, or not occurring. And so particularly at this point, because to your point about Pato having more Instagram followers than the series does, that doesn't necessarily mean that Pato is like more popular than IndyCar is, but just in terms of the footprint that the driver provides, that was not a metric that we had pre-social media.
Yeah.
And so it's a thing that we can measure now, and that ultimately the drivers do have a fairly significant influence on just what's going on because of that. This would be the case Formula One, NASCAR, whatever. IndyCar does have a very diverse driver profile just as a series. But that there aren't, without it racing in some of those places, it doesn't really create a strong enough connection point, in my opinion, to those locations, whether they be European or, you know, South Pacific, or, you know, whatever, Australia, New Zealand, or, you know, South America. You know, it's kind of this loose loose tie. That's basically just a driver. Does that driver have fans in that place? Are they also following all the races on whatever platform they can? Like, are we providing an ability, are we making this accessible at all? Via it being on a network that somebody who just has cable TV or something can get versus something that has to be subscribed to or whatever. And then the other part of that is the obvious, that social kind of is over the top of all of that stuff. So can people just like gain access to IndyCar via like media coverage? I mean, broadly speaking, now there's enough ways to do that distribution is wide enough that you sort of see that occurring. But that, this probably doesn't need to be explained, that like the amplification that you get of that thing, if you actually go race in those places. If we went to Surfers, if we were in Mexico City, if we had a race, in the middle of Europe somewhere, that, if you went, I don't know, whatever, you went to Zandvoort, you went to, just throwing stuff at the wall here, Brands GP, like how badass would that be to go back to some of those places, to just go to those places the way that we used to just occasionally just go to these places, the way, because you get a promoter that on a 1-year deal decides that they're going to fork out enough cash that like it kind of makes sense for the series and the teams to do it. That probably all by itself doesn't move the needle. But if it's with the strategic intention of creating this amplification and doing the other things to make sure that you then retain the value of that expanded, sort of engagement that you get from these places, like that, the ability to do that is fundamentally something different now because of the media landscape, that's inclusive of social and all of these other things that are not just TV based, to maintain engagement. All of that ultimately points back to, is the actual product, is the thing, outside of the fact that we've got a great race winning, super competitive Mexican driver, great race winning, super competitive Kiwis, Australians, European guys, whatever. So outside of that, I mean, IndyCar does have all of those things kind of in spades in a way that it actually hasn't, like historically consistently, let's say over the last 20 years, besides Scott Dixon and Will Power, basically. But otherwise it's been sort of, yeah, you get the occasional guy here or there, but like, do they stay in the series for that long? Are they in long-term good rides? Are they, whatever? Not always, basically. Like, you look back to Champ Car when they were doing more European events, it was kind of like, okay, Champ Car at that point was kind of a shell of itself as CART, right? And so I guess what I'm circling around to here is you do have a lot of those things which could be taken advantage of in a way that maybe they couldn't have been, or weren't as quite at the heightened level that they are now at every point along the way over the last 10 or 20 years. But that, it ultimately also points back to like, is IndyCar, is the product of IndyCar and all the things that are a part of that, is that just by itself compelling enough to make all of this work, or is it good enough as long as you have like some drivers that have huge fan bases that are going to be a super integral part of pulling those events off, kind of. And I think that's really the, like, you got to take a long, hard look in the mirror and recognize that, in Mexico, yeah, you're going to have Formula One does go there. Formula E does go there. It's kind of its own thing in its own ways. NASCAR is going to go there. NASCAR with Daniel Suarez there is going to be, people are going to be losing their effing minds at a NASCAR race there. Can IndyCar going there, does that, and that each of those things, even NASCAR, whatever you think of NASCAR to IndyCar at like the odd track in the US, NASCAR going international somewhere, NASCAR is like its own brand of hyper Americana that you're like taking on the road like a traveling circus to go somewhere and go do this whole thing. Like there are aspects of that IndyCar kind of like doesn't quite have that same type of gravity just as a thing, brand gravity, like going to another place. Like the differentiation is, of NASCAR and Formula One are like really starkly different, right, from that point of view, whereas IndyCar maybe doesn't have quite as many of those differentiating factors. So I guess I think that IndyCar should be thinking about, there's a lot of opportunity for IndyCar, in my opinion, to find the right strategic locations to be racing outside of the US and even outside of North America. But from my personal point of view, it really needs to be thinking about all of those things. Like it's definitely not, and maybe this is part of your point, like there's no guarantee that you show up at Mexico City and have like a massively attended, huge, successful race. Like you have to be able to activate these other things and really, know thyself in a way. Like what is the thing that we are uniquely bringing to the table here as the IndyCar series? And it's not good enough for it just to be good racing, I don't think. Like I think that's kind of the critical thing, that when we're talking about, this expands to all of this stuff. When we're talking about a new car, when we're talking about new engines, when we're talking about all of this stuff, like the product is inclusive of all that stuff, and that all of that stuff ultimately does matter in terms of creating differentiation around, between all of these other sports products.
Thanks for that insight, Joe. It's always great to get your wider thoughts about IndyCar, because we get so caught up in analysing these races that sometimes it's nice to just take a step back and just look at things from a more holistic point of view, which you can't always do. I guess you're in a bit of a better position to do that kind of thing now, with a little bit more kind of zoomed out perspective, which is nice. We mentioned Scott McLaughlin, fairly, maybe not as straightforward a win as maybe it feels like in hindsight, but he was struggling a little bit in traffic like he was on the Saturday race early on in the Sunday race, and was passed by Will Power, but just always seemed to be hanging around and just doing a good job, just kind of dotting his I's, crossing his T's, and just kind of keeping everything pretty conservative, but just making sure he was in there, making sure he was adaptable, and just making sure he was aware of what everybody else was doing, and just basically bringing it home, and did a great job of it. So a proper, well, we saw what happened to Will to Power with the spin. That kind of thing can happen to anyone at any moment, and when the opportunities arose, Scott made sure that he was ready, and he wasn't worried about people doing different strategies and people kind of diversifying what they were doing. He was just kind of stuck with his strategy and reacted well. So it was good to see him doing well. There's another few names I kind of wanted to pick out and mention. Obviously, Connor Daly got the podium, Juncos Honga's first podium as well on the Saturday, which was a big result for them because they jumped up 4 places in the fight for the leader circle, which was massive. If you've not heard us talk about the leader circle before, you're not aware what it is, they're basically the top 22 cars in the entrant points. So it's done by car number basically rather than driver in this sense. The top 22 are awarded $1 million at the end of the year, providing that they've done all of the races and satisfied the contract that they have with IndyCar. The contract element is where it gets a bit complicated because the leader circle is a contract between the teams and the series, so the details of it are not really discussed, and you only kind of really get information by it leaking out from people as opposed to any sort of public. There's not like a website where you can just go and Google leader circle points. You have to wait for someone like me to work it out for you. So in terms of going into Nashville, we've got 4 cars just above the cutoff line and 3 cars below it, all in contention. So 19th, you've got Daly, who's up those 4 positions. He was actually outside of the top 22 going into this weekend, so has jumped up into it massively. He's 15 points clear of it now. The Meyershank number 66 with Malukas is 13 points ahead in 20th. We've got the Rahal Letterman Lanigan number 30, Fittipaldi in 21st. He's 3 points ahead, so a really difficult weekend for him. And that Portland weekend where he had that penalty early on and then things just went downhill, being rubbed in a little bit. But probably the worst of the lot really was the AJ 4041 of Stingray Rob, while Santino Ferrucci got his his first 2 top fives of the year, believe it or not, even though he was on pole in Portland. It was his first 2 top fives. He scored 4th in both races. He was the only driver to score 2 top fives across the 2 races. And Stingray was actually down 2 positions in the rankings there, and he's only 1 point clear of the leader circle cutoff. And then just outside the cutoff now is the 20 of Christian Rasmussen, who did score quite a few points, to be fair to him, in his I guess not really his oval debut, but he's been doing the road and street courses and the Indy 500 this year and has stepped in to replace Ed Carpenter for the last few races. Did a good job, some good results there for him. Catherine Legg was 15 points off in 24th, and Jack Harvey's 38 points down in 25th. That was the car that didn't qualify for the Indy 500, so that's quite a big hole there in terms of the points. But a good weekend for Coyne. I think across the course of the weekend, probably their best of the year in terms of their performance. And I know they had a really difficult test there at Milwaukee, quite a few weeks before the actual race weekend, where it was looking quite bleak. So to bounce back and have such a strong weekend was impressive for them. So yeah, Connor Daly did very well to bag a podium. We mentioned Ferrucci with his 2 top fives, and yeah, I guess Linus Lundqvist we have to mention as well, because he sealed the Rookie of the Year championship despite having a pretty odd weekend in many ways. He was 6th in the first race and raced really well from 5th on the grid in that one, but in the second race he was the kind of instigator of all the carnage at the start of the race, where he hit Marcus Armstrong hit Joseph Newgarden. That took Joseph Newgarden out of the race. He was in crashes in both races, Joseph Newgarden, so no good point scores for him across the 2 races. But Linus, wrapping up the Rookie of the Year title after the weekend and finished 20th in the Sunday race because he had a late crash and also had a drive through for that early, his part in the start drama there as well. Who else have we got to mention? We definitely need to mention Louis Foster as well, who wrapped up the Indy Next Championship, 7 wins on the year, 6 poles. And on 5 different occasions this year, he's had pole, fastest lap and the race win in a weekend, which is pretty staggering, really, when you think about it, even for an Indy Next Championship bid. Try not to be too biased towards a fellow Brit here, and I'm sure I will get accused of that at some point, but a pretty dominant season and another Indy Next title for Andretti after a little gap with HMD having a little spell of dominance there. Was there anyone else across the 2 races, JL, that you wanted to pick out and mention? I know I feel like we could sit here all day and literally go through both races and pick it all out, but we've got an hour to kind of chew through this stuff, and I think we've probably picked out the major storylines.
Yeah, I think the only one that I'd just give a shout out to was Colton Herta. I think sort of for no fault of his own, not really picking up quite the results that he ended up on the podium on the second day, but I felt like he could have been on the podium on the first day as well. That first race, some of where guys ended up, and I think everybody who was up there in the end was totally deserving. Connor, even though Connor did, benefit somewhat substantially at times by just the strategy kind of working the way that they did it. Obviously the first race was very much like everybody's all over the place. You kind of had no idea how it was going to pan out, and that there wasn't even necessarily a lot of rhyme or reason, or there was no obvious pattern that emerged until like the end of the race, basically. Like it was kind of the guys that pitted early in one stop, like obviously gained a huge advantage, and then the guys that pitted early the next time around basically did the exact same thing, just came out behind like the wrong cars and got totally hosed. And it was like, wait, what? Like, what's going on here? And then obviously, by race 2, the strategies at least had all converged enough that they were a little bit easier to track and pay attention to. They didn't get screwed up. Nobody got heavily advantaged or disadvantaged by when yellows came out and this and that, or it wasn't affecting as many cars that were kind of in contention as it seemed like it was happening in the first race. But Colton just kind of obviously having the wheel not get put on all the way, and that completely ruined his race. Just felt like he was one of the guys out there who, to me, we talked about this earlier in the year as him being one of the guys that hasn't notched an oval win. And I think this was another weekend that will kind of go under the radar as, he just, didn't get it. It's another weekend that he didn't get an oval win, but where he actually drove very well on in difficult circumstances on a tough oval. So just a quick shout out for him. Rossi also did a really good job just in terms of what the guys were doing in the cars, basically. Probably pissed at himself for not managing to stick it on the podium there in the second race. Just getting past, I think, from second, right, on that late race restart, got snuck by Dixon. Just was like on the hammer there at the end of the race. Like that was as deep into the corner as I heard somebody go flat. Like I mean, I mean, he was setting fastest laps of the race at the end of the race there, I think.
Yeah.
And maybe they were just getting like a little bit of enough coverage from the grandstands on like the exit of 4 entry to 1 or something. But yeah, I was like, oh, that's how it like used to be. Like you used to basically into 1, you used to like, if you went and stood on the inside of 1 and 2 just in practice, you could tell which guys were fast or slow just by standing there and like listening to how far they kept it wide open, bending into the corner. And after an entire race of watching guys like off throttle banging downshifts going into the corner to just hear on the onboard, like, yeah, like all the way past turn in, it's kind of like, oh, he's like getting after it. So just some cool little things to point out for the next time around, I guess.
Yeah, it makes you wonder what, going back to Rossi, it makes you wonder what Pato would have been able to do in the second race. He
Totally.
and Nolan Siegel both lost gearboxes in that second race. It'd be interesting to know whether that, kind of what happened there. If it's rare for one team to lose, 2 cars through gearbox issues in the same race. So I'm kind of wondering what the analysis of that will be. But I'm glad you brought Dixon up as well, because his second in the second race was enough for him to secure his 142nd podium, which Honda claims makes him now the all-time podium record holder in IndyCar. So pretty cool stat. I'm sure he's going to continue to add to that for another couple of years at least. So that number's going to get a lot bigger. Next
20 years.
20 years of Scott Dixon putting it on the podium. Yeah, for sure. That's something for everyone to look forward to. And yeah, Herta, I'm glad you mentioned him as well, with the wheel coming off in the first race and then on the podium in the second race. And he tried to do one less stop than everybody else in the second race, didn't he? And had a little gamble towards the end there. I think he had a bit of a gamble in the first race as well, didn't he, at one point as well? So it was nice to see Andretti taking some gambles with strategies there. And Colton's still waiting for an oval win, but definitely didn't lack pace across the course of the weekend there. All right, so we've got into Milwaukee. I know we've probably missed some bits, but it's definitely a lot to get 2 races into an hour-long podcast, so I hope we've done a good enough job of that. You can head to the-race.com and check out race reports on both races and some features that will be coming out that are either out or will be coming out, depending on when you're listening to this podcast. You can also check us out on Patreon, where you can get early access to the Races podcast network. You can get ad-free listening. There's also like merch discounts, all sorts of special offers and stuff there, access to tickets and stuff like that. So if you're interested in all that, you can go and check us out there. Don't forget our YouTube channel as well, which is mostly Formula 1 dominated, but if you're into Formula 1, it's definitely the place to be in terms of YouTube. That's all for this week's episode of the Race IndyCar Podcast, and we're back next week with a preview of Nashville, the final round of the 2024 season.
The Athletic.